The gunshot that rang through the canyon that summer evening in 1878 wasn't meant for her. But Rebecca Sutton still felt its echo in her bones as she crouched by the dying fire outside the small adobe shelter she'd called home for the past 3 months. The shot had come from somewhere in the Rocky Hills above Del Rio, Texas, probably a hunter after wild game or perhaps something more sinister. But she'd learned in her 22 years not to investigate every sound that punctured the desert silence. Instead, she focused on the intricate pattern of blue and white beads threaded on the sinew in her calloused hands, her fingers moving with the practiced precision her Apache mother had taught her before the fever took her 5 winters ago. Rebecca knew she was neither fully one thing nor another, caught between two worlds that had little patience for those who straddled the divide. Her father had been a trader from Missouri, a man with kind eyes and restless feet who'd loved her mother with a devotion that scandalized both their peoples. When he'd been killed in a skirmish with bandits near the Rio Grande, her mother had retreated deeper into Apache territory, raising Rebecca with the skills and stories of her people, while the girl's pale skin and brown hair marked her as different from the other children. Now, with both parents gone and the Apache bands scattered by the Army's relentless pressure, Rebecca had made her solitary camp on the outskirts of Del Rio, surviving by trading the beadwork that was the last tangible connection to her mother's memory. The fire crackled and spat, sending up sparks that died quickly in the gathering darkness. Rebecca held up the partially completed bracelet, examining it in the firelight. The geometric pattern represented water flowing through mountains, a design her mother had said brought protection to the wearer. Her fingers ached from hours of work, but the familiar motion soothed something in her that words couldn't reach. Out here, alone with her beads and her fire, she didn't have to explain herself to anyone or endure the suspicious stares of townsfolk who whispered about the half-breed woman living like a savage just beyond their proper civilization. She was so absorbed in threading a particularly stubborn bead that she didn't hear the footsteps until they were nearly upon her. Her hand instinctively moved toward the knife at her belt, but she forced herself to stillness as a man's voice cut through the night. "Easy there. I'm not looking for trouble." Rebecca's eyes lifted to take in the stranger standing at the edge of her firelight. He was tall, lean in the way of men who spent their days in the saddle, with dust coating his worn denim pants and a hat pulled low over his face. As he stepped closer, pushing the hat back, she saw he was young, probably no more than 25, with sun-darkened skin and eyes that held a wariness she recognized, because she saw it in her own reflection every time she glimpsed herself in the river. "This is my camp," she said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I haven't taken anything from anyone, and I don't want any trouble either." The cowboy raised his hands in a peaceful gesture, and she noticed that his right palm was wrapped in a stained bandage. "I'm not here to run you off, miss. Name's Matthew Turner. I work for the Double T Ranch about 15 miles northwest of here." He hesitated, glancing at the beadwork in her hands. "I saw your fire from the ridge and thought maybe you'd have some water to spare. My canteen ran dry about an hour back, and my horse pulled up lame. I'm walking him back slow." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, weighing the truth in his words against the caution that had kept her alive. Finally, she gestured to the water skin hanging from a post near the shelter. "Help yourself. There's a stream about half a mile east if you need more." "Much obliged." Matthew moved carefully, clearly aware that one wrong move might send her bolting like a spooked deer. He took the water skin and drank deeply, then carried some to where his horse stood in the shadows beyond the fire. When he returned, he didn't immediately leave as Rebecca had expected. Instead, He stood awkwardly at the edge of the firelight, his eyes drawn repeatedly to the beadwork in her hands. "That's real pretty work," he said after a moment. "My sister used to do needlepoint, but I never seen anything quite like that." "It's Apache beading," Rebecca said, then immediately wondered why she'd offered that information. She usually kept her words as spare as her possessions. "Apache." Matthew's voice held curiosity rather than the fear or hostility she'd grown accustomed to hearing. "You learned that from the tribes, from my mother." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying all the grief and defiance she usually kept locked away. Matthew seemed to sense he'd touched on something tender. He shifted his weight, and in the firelight, Rebecca could see the exhaustion etched in the lines around his eyes. "Well, it's beautiful. Must take a steady hand and a lot of patience." Something in his genuine appreciation made Rebecca's shoulders relax slightly. "It takes both. And good eyes. The light's not so good now, but in daylight you can see the patterns better." "How'd you learn to do it?" Matthew asked, and then quickly added, "If you don't mind my asking." "I don't mean to pry into your business." Rebecca set down her beadwork, flexing her fingers. The evening had grown cool, and she added a few small branches to the fire. "My mother taught me when I was young. She said the patterns tell stories, and if you learn to read them, you can carry your people's history in your hands." Matthew's face softened. "That's a fine thing, keeping those stories alive." He paused, then seemed to make a decision. "Look, I know I'm imposing on your hospitality already, but would you mind if I rested here for a bit? My horse really is lame, and I've been in the saddle since before dawn. I'll move on at first light, and I can pay you for the trouble." Every instinct told Rebecca to refuse, to maintain the careful distance she kept from everyone. But something in Matthew's tired honesty made her nod. "You can rest, but keep to that side of the fire and keep your weapons where I can see them." "Fair enough." Matthew unbuckled his gun belt and laid it carefully on the ground before settling himself on a flat rock opposite Rebecca. He removed his hat, running a hand through dark hair that was matted with sweat and dust. For a few minutes, they sat in silence, the fire crackling between them and the vast Texas sky spreading stars overhead like scattered diamonds. Rebecca picked up her beadwork again, trying to ignore the presence of the stranger. But she found herself acutely aware of him, the way he moved, the thoughtful expression on his face as he watched the fire. Finally, unable to contain her curiosity, she asked, "What happened to your hand?" Matthew looked down at the bandaged palm as if he'd forgotten about it. "Caught it on some barbed wire this morning while mending a fence. It's nothing serious, just bleeds like the devil." "That bandage needs changing," Rebecca observed, "and it should be cleaned properly or it'll fester." "I was planning to see to it when I got back to the ranch, but my horse had other ideas." Matthew smiled ruefully. "Seems like one of those days where nothing goes quite right." Rebecca found herself standing before she'd consciously decided to help. She disappeared into her small shelter and returned with a clean cloth and a small clay jar. "The bandage off," she said, her tone brooking no argument. Matthew unwrapped the soiled bandage, revealing a nasty gash across his palm that was still seeping blood. Rebecca knelt beside him, taking his hand in hers with a clinical efficiency that masked the strange flutter she felt at the contact. She cleaned the wound with water, then applied a paste from the clay jar. "What is that?" Matthew asked, watching her work. "Herbs and clay. My mother's recipe. It'll help it heal faster and keep infection out." Her fingers worked quickly, wrapping his hand with the clean cloth and tying it securely. "Try to keep it dry and change the bandage tomorrow." "Thank you," Matthew said softly. "That's real kind of you, especially to a stranger." Rebecca returned to her seat, suddenly self-conscious about the intimacy of touching him. It's nothing. Just seemed foolish to let a wound go bad when it's easily treated. They lapsed into silence again, but it felt different now, less wary and more companionable. Matthew watched as Rebecca resumed her beading, her nimble fingers working the needle through the leather backing with hypnotic precision. After a while, he spoke again. How do you decide on the patterns? Is there meaning to each one, or do you just make them up as you go? Rebecca considered the question, surprised by her own willingness to answer. Both, I suppose. Traditional patterns have specific meanings passed down through generations. This one, she held up the bracelet, represents water through mountains. It's meant to bring protection. But sometimes I combine patterns or create new ones based on what feels right. Could you teach someone to do it? Matthew asked. Or is it something you have to be born into? Anyone with patience could learn the basics, Rebecca said, though mastering it takes years. Why do you ask? Matthew leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with genuine interest. I've always been fascinated by crafts, by making things with your hands. On the ranch, it's all about cattle and horses and mending what breaks, but there's something about creating something beautiful that appeals to me. My mother used to say I had artistic hands, which my father thought was about the silliest thing a rancher's son could have. There was something vulnerable in his admission that made Rebecca see him differently. She'd expected a typical cowboy, rough and dismissive, concerned only with cattle and cards. Instead, she found herself sitting across from a man who appreciated beauty and wasn't afraid to admit it. It's not silly, she said firmly. Beautiful things matter. They remind us that life is more than just surviving. Matthew met her eyes across the fire, and something passed between them, a recognition of kindred spirits. That's exactly it. That's exactly what I've always thought but couldn't quite put into words. Before Rebecca could respond, Matthew's horse whinnied softly from the darkness. Matthew stood and went to check on the animal, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. Rebecca watched him run gentle hands down the horse's leg, examining the lameness with evident concern. There was tenderness in the way he handled the animal that spoke of a good heart. When he returned to the fire, Rebecca surprised herself by asking, "Have you eaten today?" Matthew hesitated. "Not since breakfast, but I don't want to impose any more than I already have. I have some cornmeal cakes and dried meat. It's not much, but you're welcome to share." Rebecca was already moving to retrieve the food before he could protest. As she prepared a simple meal, warming the cornmeal cakes on a flat stone near the fire, she wondered at her own behavior. She'd spent 3 months avoiding human contact, and here she was feeding a stranger and engaging in the longest conversation she'd had since arriving in Del Rio. They ate in comfortable silence, the food simple but satisfying. When they finished, Matthew leaned back against a rock and looked up at the stars. "You live out here alone all the time?" "Yes, it suits me." Rebecca's voice held a note of defiance as if expecting judgment. "I can understand that. Sometimes people are more trouble than they are worth." Matthew's tone was matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "But doesn't it get lonely?" The question hit closer to home than Rebecca liked. Lonely is better than being treated like you don't belong anywhere. Matthew was quiet for a moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "I'm sorry people have treated you poorly. From what I've seen tonight, they're missing out on knowing someone worth knowing." Rebecca felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. She wasn't used to kindness, especially not from strangers. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're generous to strangers, skilled at your craft, and smart enough to survive out here on your own. That's more than I can say for most folks I meet." Matthew's voice was earnest, without a trace of flattery or manipulation. They talked late into the night, the conversation flowing with surprising ease. Matthew told her about growing up on his family's ranch, about losing his parents to cholera 3 years ago, and taking over the management of the Double T with his older brother. He spoke of the challenges of ranching in Texas, of drought and cattle rustlers, and the constant struggle to keep the operation profitable. But he also talked about the beauty of watching sunrise over the plains, the satisfaction of a successful roundup, the way the land got into your blood until you couldn't imagine living anywhere else. In turn, Rebecca found herself sharing more than she'd intended. She spoke of her childhood moving between Apache camps and trading posts, of learning 2 languages and 2 ways of seeing the world. She told him about her mother's death and the way it had severed her connection to the Apache community, how her father's white blood made her suspect among her mother's people, even as her Apache heritage made her unwelcome in white society. She described the loneliness of belonging nowhere, the weariness of always being on guard. "That sounds hard," Matthew said simply when she finished. "Harder than most people will ever have to face." "I survive." Rebecca's voice was steady, but there was a wealth of pain beneath the words. "You do more than survive. You create beautiful things and make a life on your own terms. That takes strength." Matthew's admiration was evident in his voice. As the fire burned low, Matthew stood and stretched. "I should let you get some rest. I've taken up enough of your evening." "Where will you go?" Rebecca asked, suddenly reluctant to see him leave. "Your horse is still lame." "I'll make camp just up the trail a ways. I've got a bedroll and the night's mild enough." "You could stay here," Rebecca heard herself say, "by the fire. It's safer than being out in the open, and your horse is already settled." Matthew looked at her carefully, as if assessing whether she truly meant the offer. "If you're sure, I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "I wouldn't have offered if I wasn't sure." Rebecca's tone was firm. "But you stay on that side of the fire." A slow smile spread across Matthew's face. "Yes, madam, and thank you for everything tonight." Matthew retrieved his bedroll and settled on the opposite side of the fire from Rebecca's shelter. She retreated inside the small adobe structure, but found herself lying awake on her blankets, hyper-aware of Matthew's presence just outside. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt this strange combination of anxiety and anticipation. Part of her warned that letting him stay was foolish, that trust only led to betrayal. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant for so long she'd almost forgotten it existed, whispered that maybe, just maybe, not everyone was to be feared. When dawn broke over the Texas hills, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Rebecca emerged from her shelter to find Matthew already awake, tending to his horse and building up the fire. He'd heated water in her small pot, and the smell of coffee filled the air. "Morning," he said with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I hope you don't mind. I found the coffee in your supplies and thought I'd make myself useful." "I don't mind." Rebecca accepted the tin cup he offered, wrapping her hands around its warmth. The coffee was strong and good, better than she usually managed to make. They shared a simple breakfast of the remaining cornmeal cakes, and then Matthew examined his horse's leg again. "Swelling's gone down some. I think he can make it back to the ranch if I take it slow." Rebecca felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Of course he was leaving. He had a life to return to, responsibilities. Last night had been a pleasant interlude, nothing more. "Good. I hope the journey goes well." Matthew finished saddling his horse but didn't immediately mount. Instead, he turned to Rebecca, his expression thoughtful. "I was wondering if maybe I could come back. Visit, I mean. I'd like to learn more about that beadwork if you'd be willing to teach me." Rebecca's heart skipped, but she kept her voice neutral. "Why would you want to learn beading?" "Because it's beautiful, and because you make it look like meditation, and because I'd like an excuse to see you again." Matthew's honesty was disarming. "But if you'd rather I didn't come back, I'll respect that." Rebecca should have said no. Every self-protective instinct screamed at her to maintain her isolation, to not let anyone close enough to hurt her. But when she opened her mouth, different words emerged. "You can come back. If you want to learn, I'll teach you." The smile that lit Matthew's face made something warm bloom in Rebecca's chest. "How about tomorrow evening? I can bring some supplies from town, things you might need." "I don't need charity." "Not charity. Trade. You teach me beading, I bring supplies. Fair exchange." Matthew's tone was firm but gentle. Rebecca considered, then nodded. "Tomorrow evening, then. But don't expect to master it quickly. It takes time." "I'm a patient man," Matthew said, swinging up into his saddle. His horse shifted its weight but seemed sound enough to travel. "Thank you again, Rebecca, for the water and the food and the company. It's been the best evening I've had in a long while." He touched his hat brim in farewell and turned his horse toward the northwest. Rebecca watched until he disappeared behind a rise, then stood staring at the empty landscape for several minutes longer. She felt unmoored, as if the careful routine of her solitary life had been disrupted in ways she didn't yet understand. The day passed slowly. Rebecca tried to focus on her beadwork, on gathering water from the stream, on the 100 small tasks that filled her days. But her mind kept drifting back to the previous night, to the easy way Matthew had talked with her, to the genuine interest in his eyes when he'd watched her work. She told herself not to read too much into it, that he was probably just bored and curious, that he might not even return tomorrow as promised. But as the sun began its descent the following evening, Rebecca found herself watching the western horizon, her beadwork lying forgotten in her lap. When she finally spotted the distant figure of a rider, her pulse quickened. She forced herself to remain seated, to appear calm and unconcerned, even as part of her wanted to stand and wave like a foolish girl. Matthew rode into camp as the sky turned the color of peaches, a pack tied to his saddle and a grin on his face. "Evening, Rebecca. Hope I'm not too early. You're right on time." Rebecca stood, wiping her suddenly damp palms on her skirt. "How's your hand?" Matthew held up his palm, showing a fresh bandage. "Healing well, thanks to your medicine. Barely hurts anymore." He dismounted and began unloading items from his pack. There was coffee, flour, sugar, dried beans, and strips of salted beef. But he also produced a small bundle of glass beads in colors Rebecca rarely saw, rich purples and deep greens. "I went to the trading post in Del Rio," Matthew explained. "Asked what they had for beading supplies. The owner's wife seemed to know what I was talking about and put this together. If it's not the right kind, I can take it back." Rebecca took the bundle with reverent hands. The beads were beautiful, their colors deep and lustrous in the fading light. "These are perfect. They must have been expensive. Worth it if you'll teach me your craft." Matthew's eyes held that same genuine interest she'd seen the first night. They settled on opposite sides of the fire, and Rebecca began gathering her beading supplies. She selected a piece of tanned leather, soft and pliable, along with sinew for thread, a bone needle, and an array of beads in different colors. Matthew watched her every move with the focused attention of a good student. "First, you need to understand the materials," Rebecca began, falling into the rhythm of teaching as her mother had once taught her. "The leather must be soft enough to work with but strong enough to hold the beads. The sinew is traditional, though some people use thread now. Each bead is chosen not just for color, but for size and how it will sit next to its neighbors." She demonstrated how to prepare the sinew, how to thread the needle, how to make the first stitch that would anchor the beadwork. Matthew's hands, large and calloused from ranch work, looked clumsy at first with the delicate materials. But he had patience and determination, listening carefully to her instructions and attempting each step with serious concentration. "Your stitches are too loose," Rebecca said after watching him struggle with his first attempt. "May I?" At his nod, she moved around the fire to sit beside him. Taking his hands in hers, she guided them through the proper motion, showing him how to tension the sinew just right, how to angle the needle to catch the leather without piercing through. Being this close to him, she was aware of his warmth, the smell of leather and sage that clung to him, the way his breath caught slightly when her fingers touched his. "Like this." Matthew attempted the stitch again, and this time it was better. "Yes, exactly like that." Rebecca's voice came out softer than she'd intended. She became aware of how intimate this moment was, their heads bent together over the beadwork, their shoulders nearly touching. She should move back to her side of the fire, but she found herself reluctant to break the connection. They worked as the light faded and the stars emerged, Rebecca patiently correcting Matthew's mistakes and praising his progress. He was a quick learner, adapting to the unfamiliar work with a grace that surprised her. His initial clumsiness gave way to growing confidence, and by the time full darkness had fallen, he'd completed a small section of simple beading. "It's not much to look at," Matthew said, holding up his work with a self-deprecating smile. "It's a good start. My first attempts looked far worse." Rebecca examined his work critically but fairly. "You have steady hands. That's the most important thing." Matthew looked pleased by the praise. They took a break to eat, and Matthew told her about his day at the ranch, about a disagreement with his brother over which pastures to use for grazing, about a new foal that had been born that morning. Rebecca found herself laughing at his stories, the sound strange to her own ears after so many months of silence. "What about you?" Matthew asked. "What did you do today?" "The same as every day. Beadwork, gathering water and firewood, preparing food." Rebecca shrugged. "Nothing exciting." "Do you trade the beadwork in town?" Rebecca's expression darkened. "Sometimes. There's a woman who runs a dress shop, Mrs. Chen. She's Chinese, understands what it's like to be an outsider. She sells my work to travelers and takes a small commission. It's enough to buy supplies." "You don't go into town yourself?" "Not if I can help it." Rebecca's voice was flat. "People there have made their feelings about me clear enough." Matthew's jaw tightened. "What kind of things have they said?" "The usual. That I'm savage, dangerous. That I shouldn't be living so close to town. Some of the men think a woman alone is an invitation." Rebecca met his eyes steadily. "I learned quickly to avoid Del Rio except when absolutely necessary." "That's not right." Matthew's anger was evident but controlled. "You shouldn't have to live in fear." "I don't live in fear. I live with caution. There's a difference." Rebecca's pride colored her words. "I can take care of myself." "I don't doubt that for a second." Matthew's tone was admiring. "But it still isn't right. You deserve better." They returned to the beadwork, and Matthew continued his lesson with focused determination. Rebecca found herself enjoying the role of teacher, the way his face lit up when he got a technique right, the questions he asked that showed he was really thinking about the craft. As the night wore on, their conversation ranged from beading to stories of their childhoods to observations about the land and the animals that lived on it. "Tell me about the patterns," Matthew said as he worked on a second small piece. "You said they tell stories. How does that work?" Rebecca picked up a completed bracelet and traced the geometric design with her finger. "This pattern is called Turtle's Back. It represents strength and longevity. The turtle carries his home with him, always protected, always self-sufficient. This one," she indicated a different design, "represents mountains and sky, the meeting of earth and heaven. It's meant to bring balance. And the one you're working on now." Rebecca looked down at the partially completed belt she'd been beading for the past week. The pattern was complex, interweaving several traditional designs in a way that created something new. I'm not sure yet. It's evolving as I work on it. Sometimes the beads tell their own story, and you just have to follow where they lead. Matthew studied the belt with admiration. It's beautiful, like watching a story unfold in color and shape. His understanding of what she was trying to express made Rebecca's heart swell. She'd never had anyone to share this with, not since her mother died. The other Apache women had been kind but distant, and white folks generally dismissed her beadwork as primitive curiosity. Having someone truly appreciate the artistry and meaning behind it felt like a gift. When Matthew finally prepared to leave, well past midnight, he carefully wrapped his beading attempts in a cloth. "Can I come back? Tomorrow or whenever you're willing to teach me more. Tomorrow might be too soon. You need to practice what you've learned." Rebecca tried to sound practical, but she couldn't quite hide the smile that tugged at her lips. "Come back in 2 days. I want to see if you've improved." 2 days it is. Matthew mounted his horse, then paused. "Rebecca, I want you to know I really enjoy this. The beading, yes, but also just talking with you. It's been a long time since I've had a conversation that felt this easy." "For me too," Rebecca admitted quietly. She watched him ride off into the darkness, then stood staring at the stars for a long time before banking the fire and retreating to her shelter. Sleep was slow to come, her mind replaying the evening, the feel of Matthew's hands under hers as she taught him, the warmth of his smile, the way he listened when she spoke as if her words truly mattered. 2 days later, Matthew returned as promised. He brought more supplies and proudly showed her the beadwork he'd practiced, which showed genuine improvement. They fell into an easy routine, meeting several evenings a week, sometimes for beading lessons and sometimes just to talk. Matthew proved to be an apt student, his initial clumsiness giving way to real skill. But more than that, he became something Rebecca hadn't had in years, a friend. As summer deepened and the Texas heat became oppressive, their friendship deepened too. Matthew brought her gifts, always practical things she needed, but sometimes with small luxuries tucked in. A bar of milled soap, a new blanket, a book he thought she might enjoy. Rebecca found herself looking forward to his visits with an eagerness that both thrilled and frightened her. She'd built her life around solitude and self-sufficiency, and now suddenly she was measuring her days by when she'd see him next. One evening in late July, Matthew arrived looking troubled. He'd been learning a complex pattern that represented the 4 directions, and his fingers moved automatically through the beading as he spoke. "My brother's been asking questions about where I've been spending my evenings." Rebecca felt a chill despite the heat. "What did you tell him?" "The truth, that I'm learning beadwork from a friend." Matthew looked up from his work. "But he thinks I'm being foolish, that a rancher has no business with such things. He's probably right, but I don't care." "Maybe you should listen to him," Rebecca said, her voice carefully neutral. "You have responsibilities, a life. You don't need to waste your time out here." Matthew set down his beading and looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "It's not a waste of time. These evenings with you are the best part of my days, Rebecca. Surely you know that by now." Rebecca's heart hammered in her chest. She'd felt the growing connection between them, but had tried to tell herself it was just friendship, just 2 lonely people finding comfort in each other's company. But the look in Matthew's eyes spoke of something deeper, something that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "Matthew, we can't." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You know we can't. Even friendship is pushing boundaries. Anything more would be impossible." "Why?" Matthew leaned forward, his dark eyes searching hers. "Because you're Apache and I'm white. Because people in town would disapprove. Those seem like their problems, not ours. You say that now, but you haven't thought about what it would really mean." Rebecca stood, needing distance, needing air. "You'd lose respect, business maybe. Your brother would be furious. And for what? For someone who doesn't fit anywhere, who has nothing to offer you." Matthew stood too, moving around the fire to stand before her. He didn't touch her, but she felt the pull of him like gravity. "You have everything to offer. You're intelligent, talented, strong, beautiful. You make me laugh. You make me think. When I'm with you, I feel like the person I was always meant to be." Tears pricked Rebecca's eyes. "Don't say things like that." "Why not if they're true?" Matthew's voice was gentle but insistent. "I know this is complicated. I know there will be challenges. But I don't care, Rebecca. I've never felt this way about anyone, and I'm not willing to walk away just because it might be difficult. It won't just be difficult. It will be impossible." Rebecca's voice broke on the last word. "I've lived this my whole life, Matthew. I know what it means to be caught between worlds. Do you really want that for yourself? I want you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them. "However that looks, whatever it takes. If you feel nothing for me, tell me now and I'll walk away. But if you feel even a fraction of what I feel, then give us a chance." Rebecca closed her eyes, fighting against the tide of longing that threatened to overwhelm her. She'd been alone for so long, had taught herself not to want things she couldn't have. But Matthew was standing here offering her something she'd never dared to dream of, not just acceptance, but love. "I feel it," she whispered finally. "I've been trying not to, but I feel it too." Matthew's exhale was shaky with relief. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. The touch, simple as it was, sent electricity through her entire body. "Then we'll figure out the rest together." That night marked a turning point. They didn't rush into anything physical beyond holding hands, both too aware of the weight of what they were beginning. But the acknowledgement of their feelings shifted something fundamental between them. The easy friendship was still there, but now it was underlaid with a deeper current of emotion and possibility. The challenges Rebecca had predicted began almost immediately. Matthew's brother, Marcus Turner, rode out to Rebecca's camp one afternoon when Matthew was at the ranch. He was older than Matthew by 3 years, with a harder look about him and none of Matthew's gentleness. "I'll be direct," Marcus said without dismounting. "I know my brother's been spending time with you. I'm asking you to send him away." Rebecca, who'd been working on a new beading pattern, set down her materials and stood. "Matthew makes his own choices. I'm not going to tell him what to do." "Then maybe you're not thinking clearly about what this means for him." Marcus's voice was cold. "He's young and idealistic and thinks the world runs on good intentions. But reality is harsher than that. If it gets around that he's involved with an Indian woman, it will hurt the ranch. People won't do business with us. We'll lose contracts and respect. I know what people think of me." Rebecca's voice was steady despite the anger rising in her chest. "Do you think I don't live with that every day? Then you should understand why this can't continue." Marcus's expression softened slightly. "Look, I have nothing personal against you. But my family built that ranch over 2 generations. Matthew's father would be heartbroken to see it damaged because his son couldn't control his urges. Get off my property." Rebecca's voice was quiet but filled with steel. "And don't come back." Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded curtly and rode away. Rebecca sank down by her fire, shaking with reaction. She'd known this was coming, had tried to warn Matthew. But having it stated so baldly, the price Matthew would pay for caring about her, made her feel sick. When Matthew arrived that evening, she told him about his brother's visit. She watched his face darken with anger and knew she had to be the strong one, the realistic one. "He's not entirely wrong," Rebecca said before Matthew could speak. "This will cost you, Matthew. Maybe more than you realize. Let me worry about that. Matthew's jaw was set in a stubborn line. Marcus doesn't speak for me, but he speaks for the reality we live in. Rebecca took his hands, willing him to understand. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything your family built. The ranch isn't everything. It's not even close to the most important thing. Matthew's eyes were fierce with conviction. You are. They had the same argument in different forms over the following weeks. Matthew remained steadfast, refusing to be swayed by either his brother's disapproval or Rebecca's practical concerns. He continued his visits, continued learning beadwork, continued falling deeper in love with a woman who both returned his feelings and feared where they would lead. The situation came to a head in late August. Matthew arrived at Rebecca's camp not in the evening as usual but in the afternoon, riding hard and fast. Rebecca looked up from her work in alarm as he dismounted before his horse had fully stopped. What's wrong? Pack your things. You need to come to the ranch. Matthew's face was set in hard lines. What? Why? There was trouble in town. Some drunk cowboys were shooting off their mouths about you, saying things I won't repeat. It got back to Marcus and me. We got into it with them and things got heated. They made threats, Rebecca. Against you. Fear, cold and sharp, sliced through Rebecca. She'd faced hostility before but never direct threats of violence. What kind of threats? The kind I'm not willing to let become reality. Matthew started gathering her belongings, moving with purposeful efficiency. You're not safe out here alone anymore. You need to come where I can protect you. Matthew, I can't go to your ranch. Your brother already hates that we're together. This would only make things worse. Marcus can deal with it. Matthew's voice was uncompromising. I'm not negotiating on this, Rebecca. Your safety comes first. They argued as they packed, but Matthew was immovable. Eventually, Rebecca realized he wasn't going to leave without her and that he was genuinely worried. With a heavy heart, she loaded her possessions onto the pack horse Matthew had brought and followed him northwest toward the Double T Ranch. The ranch house was a sprawling adobe structure surrounded by outbuildings and corrals. Cattle dotted the landscape, and the whole operation spoke of years of hard work and success. Marcus was standing on the porch when they rode up, and his expression was thunderous. What the hell are you doing? He demanded of Matthew. She's staying here until those men in town calm down. Matthew dismounted and helped Rebecca down from her horse. I won't argue about this, Marcus. You're bringing her here, to our home. Marcus's voice rose. Do you have any idea what kind of message that sends? That we don't let innocent people get hurt because of bigots and cowards. Yeah, I know exactly what message it sends. Matthew's face was flushed with anger. If you have a problem with that, that's your issue to deal with. The brothers stared at each other, years of partnership and fraternal love warring with fundamental disagreement. Finally, Marcus looked away. She can stay in the old foreman's cabin, but Matthew, this has to be temporary. We can't have her living here permanently. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. Matthew's voice softened slightly. Thank you, Marcus. I know this isn't easy for you. Marcus just shook his head and walked away. Matthew led Rebecca to a small cabin at the edge of the ranch property. It was simple but sturdy, with a wood stove, a bed, a table and chairs, and windows that let in the afternoon light. After the makeshift shelter she'd been living in, it felt almost luxurious. It's not much, Matthew said, setting down her belongings. But it's safe and sound. I'm just across the yard in the main house. Anyone who wants to get to you will have to go through me first. Rebecca sank onto the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by the sudden upheaval of her life. Matthew, this can't work. You know it can't. He knelt before her, taking her hands. Listen to me. Those men in town, they're cowards who get brave when they're drunk and in a group. But they won't come here, not onto Double T land. You're safe here, and that's what matters. For how long? A week? A month? What then? Rebecca's voice was thick with unshed tears. I can't hide here forever, and you can't protect me from the whole world. Maybe not. But I can protect you from this immediate threat while we figure out what comes next. Matthew pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Please, Rebecca, trust me, trust us. She wanted to. God, how she wanted to, but trust was a luxury she'd learned not to afford. Still, looking into Matthew's earnest face, she found herself nodding. Okay, for now, but we need to be realistic about what's possible. Matthew stayed with her that evening, helping her settle in, bringing her food from the ranch house, sitting with her as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of amber and crimson. When he finally left to sleep in the main house, Rebecca lay awake on the narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch and wondering what the morning would bring. The next few days were tense. Marcus kept his distance, making his disapproval clear through his absence. The ranch hands stared at Rebecca when she emerged from the cabin, their expressions ranging from curiosity to hostility. But Matthew remained constant, eating meals with her in the cabin, bringing her beading supplies so she could work, sitting with her in the evenings as she taught him ever more complex patterns. You're getting good at this, Rebecca observed one evening, examining a wrist cuff Matthew had completed. The pattern was clean and even, the colors blending in a way that showed real artistic sensibility. I have a good teacher. Matthew smiled at her with such warmth that she felt her defenses crumbling further. Matthew, we need to talk about what happens next. His smile faded. I know. I've been thinking about it too. The men who threatened me, when will they be gone or settled down? It's not just about them anymore, Matthew admitted. Word has spread that you're here. Some of the neighboring ranchers have made comments to Marcus, nothing directly threatening but letting him know they disapprove. Rebecca's stomach sank. So I can't stay here. You could if you wanted to. I'd stand by that. Matthew took her hands, his callous thumbs tracing patterns on her knuckles. But I have another idea, a better one maybe. What? Matthew took a deep breath as if steadying himself. Marry me. Rebecca's heart stopped. What? Marry me, Matthew repeated, his eyes locked on hers. I know it's fast. I know there are 1,000 reasons why it's complicated, but I love you, Rebecca. I love you in a way I didn't know was possible, and I think, if you're honest, you love me too. Tears spilled down Rebecca's cheeks before she could stop them. You can't marry me, Matthew. Think about what you're saying. Think about what it would mean. I have been thinking about it. It's all I think about. Matthew's voice was passionate, urgent. Yes, some people will be upset. Yes, there will be challenges, but I don't care. I'd rather face those challenges with you than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. Your brother will never forgive you. Marcus will come around eventually, and if he doesn't, that's his choice. Matthew cupped her face in his hands, his touch infinitely gentle. Rebecca, I'm not asking you to make this easy on me. I'm asking you to build a life with me, whatever that looks like. Say yes. Please say yes. Rebecca searched his face, looking for any hint of doubt or hesitation. But she found only love and certainty. And in that moment, she made the leap of faith she'd been too afraid to make before. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Matthew's kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, and then deeper as years of loneliness and longing poured out between them. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Rebecca was crying in earnest now, tears of joy and fear and overwhelming emotion. When? She managed to ask. As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if we can arrange it. Matthew's grin was incandescent. There's a circuit preacher who comes through Del Rio. I'll ride into town first thing in the morning and see if he's there. If not, We'll find a judge or whoever else can make it legal." They stayed up late into the night, making plans and sharing dreams and stealing kisses like young lovers, despite the serious reality of what they were undertaking. When Matthew finally left for the main house, Rebecca lay in bed feeling like she was floating, unable to quite believe that this was real. The next morning, Matthew rode into Del Rio before dawn. Rebecca spent the day pacing the small cabin, alternating between excitement and terror. What if Matthew changed his mind once he was away from her? What if he faced such opposition in town that he realized the cost was too high? What if he was simply acting on impulse and would regret it later? But when he returned in late afternoon, his face was triumphant. "The circuit preacher is in town for 2 more days. He's agreed to marry us tomorrow evening at sunset. I've already arranged everything." Everything? Rebecca felt dizzy. "Well, the important parts. We'll need witnesses. I'm hoping Marcus will come around, but if not, I've got a few ranch hands who'd be willing. And Mrs. Chen from the dress shop, she said she'd stand up for you if you wanted." The mention of Mrs. Chen, the one person in Del Rio who'd shown Rebecca consistent kindness, made tears prick at her eyes again. "I'd like that." That night, Rebecca worked on a special piece of beadwork by lamplight. It was a small pouch, the kind traditionally used to carry sacred objects, decorated with an intricate pattern that combined elements from both Apache tradition and her own creative vision. It represented the two worlds coming together, separate patterns interweaving to create something new and beautiful. She planned to give it to Matthew as a wedding gift. The next day passed in a blur. Matthew was gone most of the day making final arrangements. Marcus appeared briefly at the cabin door, his face unreadable. "I'm not happy about this," he said without preamble, "but you're going to be my sister-in-law and I respect my brother too much to boycott his wedding. I'll be there." "Thank you," Rebecca said softly. "I know this is difficult for you. I'll try to make sure it doesn't hurt the ranch." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "Matthew says you're worth it. I guess we'll find out if he's right." His tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't actively hostile either. As sunset approached, Rebecca bathed using water heated on the cabin stove and dressed in the only good dress she owned, a simple blue cotton garment she'd made herself. She braided her hair with blue beads woven through it, a traditional Apache style her mother had worn. Her hands shook as she worked, the reality of what she was about to do hitting her fully. Matthew arrived to escort her into town, looking handsome in clean clothes with his dark hair neatly combed. His eyes widened when he saw her. "You look beautiful." "I look nervous," Rebecca countered, but she smiled. The ride into Del Rio felt surreal. The sun was setting, painting everything in golden light, and Rebecca tried to focus on that beauty rather than her anxiety. When they reached the small church at the edge of town, a handful of people were waiting. Marcus stood stiffly to one side. Mrs. Chen, a petite woman with kind eyes and silver threading through her dark hair, stepped forward and took Rebecca's hands. "I'm so happy for you, child," she said in her accented English. "You deserve joy." The preacher was an older man with a weathered face and gentle manner. He didn't seem bothered by the unusual nature of the wedding, treating Rebecca with the same respect he'd show any bride. The ceremony itself was simple and brief. Rebecca's voice shook as she spoke her vows, but Matthew's was strong and clear, ringing out in the small church as he promised to love and honor her all the days of his life. When the preacher pronounced them married, Matthew kissed her gently, and Rebecca felt something inside her that had been clenched tight for years finally relax. She was no longer alone. She belonged to someone and to somewhere, and that someone had chosen her freely and openly despite all the obstacles. They signed the marriage certificate, Marcus and Mrs. Chen serving as witnesses. As they left the church, now husband and wife, Rebecca noticed a small group of townspeople had gathered across the street. Their expressions ranged from disapproving to curious, and she instinctively moved closer to Matthew. "It's okay," he murmured, his arm around her waist. "Let them look. We've done nothing wrong." They rode back to the Double T Ranch as the stars emerged overhead. Rebecca was officially Mrs. Matthew Turner now, and the thought filled her with equal parts wonder and trepidation. When they reached the ranch, Matthew helped her down from her horse and looked toward the main house uncertainly. "I don't want to push you," he said carefully, "but you're my wife now. It seems right that you should share my room in the main house rather than staying in the cabin. But I'll understand if you'd rather take things slow." Rebecca thought about the small cabin that had been her refuge and the uncertain welcome that awaited in the main house. But she also thought about what it meant to be married, to truly commit to building a life with someone. "I want to be with my husband," she said softly. Matthew's smile could have lit the darkness. He took her hand and led her to the main house. Marcus was already there, sitting in the front room with a glass of whiskey. He stood when they entered. "Congratulations," he said stiffly. "I suppose you'll be wanting the master bedroom." "That's your room now," Matthew said. "Rebecca and I will take my old room." Marcus nodded, then surprised Rebecca by addressing her directly. "I won't pretend I think this was a smart decision, but it's done now and your family. I hope you understand that this ranch's success affects all of us now, including you." "I understand," Rebecca replied. "I'll do my best not to be a burden. See that you do." Marcus tossed back the rest of his whiskey and retreated to his room, leaving the newlyweds alone. Matthew's room was at the back of the house, a simple space with a large bed, a dresser, and windows overlooking the corral. It was masculine and practical, but Rebecca immediately began thinking how she might soften it with her weaving and beadwork. That night, they came together as husband and wife with a tenderness that brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. Matthew was gentle and patient, clearly aware that this was new for her, and their joining felt like a natural extension of the emotional intimacy they'd already built. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Rebecca felt a peace she'd never experienced before. "I love you," she whispered into the quiet. "I love you too," Matthew replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. "We're going to make this work, Rebecca. I promise you that." The following weeks were an adjustment for everyone. Marcus remained civil but distant, clearly struggling with his brother's choice. The ranch hands were a mixed bunch, some openly hostile, others cautiously neutral, and a few surprisingly kind. Rebecca tried to make herself useful, cooking meals, mending clothes, and continuing her beadwork, which she now sold through Mrs. Chen for income that she contributed to the household. In town, reactions varied. Some people refused to acknowledge Rebecca at all. Others treated her with icy politeness. But there were also unexpected allies. The doctor's wife, a woman from Boston who'd never quite fit into Del Rio society herself, made a point of speaking kindly to Rebecca when they crossed paths. A Mexican family who ran the local cantina welcomed her warmly, perhaps recognizing a fellow outsider. The real test came in September when the Double T Ranch held its annual fall gathering, a tradition where neighboring ranchers came together to discuss shared concerns and do some trading. Marcus was adamant that Rebecca should stay out of sight. "It's bad enough they know about her," he said to Matthew in an argument Rebecca overheard from the next room. "Don't rub their noses in it." "She's my wife," Matthew shot back. "She has every right to be present at our home." In the end, Rebecca made the decision herself. "I'll stay in our room during the gathering," she told Matthew. Not because I'm ashamed, but because I don't want to make things harder for you than they already are." Matthew looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. On the day of the gathering, Rebecca remained in their bedroom, working on an elaborate beaded vest she was making for Matthew. She could hear the voices of the men outside, the clinking of glasses, the occasional burst of laughter. But late in the afternoon, she heard shouting. She moved to the window and saw Matthew and another rancher, an older man with a gray beard, standing toe to toe in the yard. Marcus was between them, trying to defuse the situation. "You've shamed your family and your heritage," the older rancher was saying, his voice carrying clearly. "Marrying a savage, bringing her into your home. Your father would turn over in his grave." Matthew's fist connected with the man's jaw before anyone could react. The older rancher went down hard, and suddenly the yard erupted in chaos. Rebecca flew out of the room without thinking, running outside to find Matthew being held back by two other men while the rancher climbed to his feet, blood streaming from his split lip. "Matthew, stop," Rebecca called out, her voice cutting through the noise. Everyone turned to look at her, and she saw the calculation in their eyes, the judgment, the contempt. But she also saw the fear on Matthew's face, not for himself but for her, and she knew what she had to do. She walked to Matthew's side, taking his hand despite the audience. "I'm Rebecca Turner," she said clearly, meeting the eyes of each rancher in turn. "I'm Matthew's wife, and I'm Apache. If that's a problem for any of you, you know where the road is." The silence that followed was deafening. The older rancher spat blood into the dirt. "You'll regret this, Turner. All of you." He stormed to his horse and rode off without another word. The other ranchers began dispersing, muttering among themselves. Some looked angry, others uncomfortable, a few almost approving. When the yard had cleared except for family, Marcus turned to Rebecca with an expression she couldn't quite read. "That was either very brave or very stupid," he said finally. "Maybe both," Rebecca replied. To her surprise, Marcus's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Matthew said you had backbone. I guess he wasn't exaggerating." He looked between his brother and his new sister-in-law. "That was Jake Thornton you punched. He's been a loud mouth forever, but he's also got influence in the Cattlemen's Association. This might cost us." "Then it costs us," Matthew said flatly. "I'm not apologizing for defending my wife." Marcus sighed. "I'm not saying you should. I'm just saying we need to be prepared for consequences." He looked at Rebecca. "You might as well come to dinner with us from now on. No point hiding you away if the whole county already knows you're here." It was a small concession, but it felt like a massive shift. That evening, Rebecca sat at the table in the main house dining room, eating with Matthew and Marcus like a proper member of the family. The meal was awkward, filled with stilted conversation and long silences, but it was also a beginning. As autumn deepened into winter, a rhythm emerged. Rebecca continued her beadwork, and Matthew continued learning from her. His skills had progressed to the point where he could create complex patterns, and he found the work meditative. On cold evenings, they'd sit by the fire in their room, both beading while they talked about their days, their dreams, their hopes for the future. "I've been thinking," Matthew said one December night as snow fell softly outside. "This ranch is going to be half mine when Marcus and I eventually divide the inheritance. What would you think about building our own house? Nothing fancy, but a place that's truly ours." Rebecca looked up from her work, surprised. "Where?" "There's a spot about 2 miles east near the creek. Good water, some trees for shade. We could design it together, make it exactly what we want." Matthew's eyes were bright with the idea. "You could have a big room for your beadwork, and we could make it feel like home." "I'd like that," Rebecca said softly. The idea of a house that was theirs, where she didn't feel like a tolerated guest, appealed enormously. They began planning in earnest, drawing sketches by lamplight and discussing details. It gave them something to work toward together, a tangible symbol of their commitment to building a life. Marcus, when informed of the plan, seemed relieved to have his brother's household becoming more independent. In January, Rebecca realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complex mix of emotions: joy, fear, excitement, and a deep, primal anxiety about bringing a child into a world that had been so unkind to her. When she told Matthew, his reaction was unambiguous delight. "A baby," he breathed, pulling her into his arms. "We're going to have a baby. Are you sure this is what you want?" Rebecca asked, voicing the insecurity that gnawed at her. "A child with mixed blood who'll face the same challenges I have." Matthew pulled back to look at her seriously. "I want this child because they are ours. Because they'll be made of our love. And yes, there will be challenges, but we'll face them together. And maybe, just maybe, the world will be a little kinder to our children than it was to you." His optimism seemed naive, but Rebecca found herself wanting to believe him. As winter gave way to spring and her belly began to swell, she threw herself into preparing. She made tiny clothes with intricate beading, created soft blankets, and set up a cradle in their room. Matthew was attentive and protective, fussing over her in ways that were both endearing and occasionally annoying. Marcus's reaction to the pregnancy news was complicated but not entirely negative. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said stiffly. Another turner to help with the ranch, eventually. Construction began on their new house in April, with Matthew working on it during every spare moment and hiring help from town for the bigger jobs. Rebecca visited the site frequently, watching the structure rise from the ground and feeling a hope she'd thought long dead taking root in her heart. This was real. This was permanent. She was building something that would last. The baby came in early August during a thunderstorm that shook the ranch house. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Mrs. Chen, who had some experience with births, and the doctor from town who came grudgingly at Matthew's urgent request. Through the pain, Rebecca was aware of Matthew's presence, his hand in hers, his voice encouraging her, his refusal to leave despite the doctor's suggestion that he wait outside. When the baby finally arrived, pink and squalling and perfect, the doctor announced, "It's a boy." Matthew's tears fell freely as he held his son for the first time. "He's beautiful. He's perfect." They named him James Turner after Matthew's father. The baby had Rebecca's dark eyes and Matthew's nose, a blend of both of them that was entirely his own. As Rebecca nursed her son in the quiet hours after the birth, she felt a fierce protectiveness, unlike anything she'd known. This child would face challenges, yes, but he would also know love and acceptance from his parents in a way she never had. Marcus came to meet his nephew the next day, his expression unreadable as he looked down at the baby. "He's got the Turner chin," he said finally. "Welcome to the world, James." It was a small thing, but Rebecca heard the acceptance in it. James was family, whatever else he might be. The new house was completed in September, just in time for them to move in before the weather turned. It was a sprawling adobe structure with large windows, a spacious main room, and the dedicated workroom Matthew had promised Rebecca for her beading. They moved their belongings from the main ranch house, and for the first time since marrying, Rebecca felt like she was truly coming home. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and russets, they settled into their new life. Matthew continued his ranch work, while Rebecca managed their household and cared for James, who was a healthy, happy baby with a loud cry and an easy smile. In the evenings, they still did their beadwork together, though now it was often interrupted by the needs of their son. "He's going to grow up knowing both sides of his heritage," Rebecca said one evening, watching Matthew attempt to bead while holding the baby. "Your family's history and my mother's traditions. That will make him richer for it," Matthew replied. "He'll have twice the stories, twice the wisdom." In their second year of marriage, Mrs. Chen approached Rebecca with a proposition. A hotel in San Antonio was looking for high-quality handcrafted items to sell to wealthy travelers from the East. They'd seen some of Rebecca's work and wanted to place a large order. "This could be real money, Mrs. Chen said excitedly. "Enough to make a good living from your craft." Rebecca discussed it with Matthew that night. "It would mean long hours of work, but the income would help us become more independent from the ranch." "I think you should do it," Matthew said immediately. "Your beadwork deserves to be seen by people who'll appreciate it, and the money would allow us to expand our house, maybe hire some help." Rebecca took the commission and threw herself into the work. Her fingers flew over the beads, creating pieces that blended traditional Apache patterns with her own artistic vision. The hotel was delighted with the results and placed additional orders. Money began to flow in, not a fortune but enough to make a real difference. As their financial situation improved, so did their standing in the community, slowly and incrementally. Some people would never accept them, but others gradually softened. The Mexican families in Del Rio welcomed Rebecca more openly. The doctor's wife became a genuine friend, stopping by the house for tea and conversation. Even some of the Anglo ranchers began to nod in acknowledgement when they encountered Matthew in town, recognizing that his marriage hadn't destroyed him as predicted. Marcus thawed considerably after James's first birthday, when the boy took his first steps toward his uncle's outstretched arms. Something in Marcus's stern face cracked at the sight of his nephew's triumphant smile, and from that day forward, he became a doting uncle, spoiling James with carved wooden toys and teaching him to recognize different cattle breeds. "You know," Marcus said to Rebecca one evening when he'd stopped by their house for dinner, "I was wrong about you. I judged you before I knew you, and that wasn't fair. You've been good for my brother and you're a good mother. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that." Rebecca, who'd been setting the table, stopped and looked at her brother-in-law in surprise. "Thank you. That means more than you know. Matthew's a better man with you than he was without you," Marcus continued. "And that boy of yours is going to grow up strong and smart. The ranch will be lucky to have him if he chooses that life." It was full acceptance finally, and Rebecca felt years of tension drain away. They were family, truly, and that meant something. When Rebecca became pregnant again in the spring of their third year of marriage, she approached it with more confidence than the first time. This pregnancy was easier, and in December, she gave birth to a daughter they named Rose. The little girl had Matthew's lighter hair but Rebecca's features, and she was smaller and quieter than James had been, watching the world with serious dark eyes. "Now we have one of each," Matthew said, cradling his daughter while James climbed onto the bed to meet his sister. "Our family feels complete," but life had more in store for them. Over the next several years, 2 more children arrived, another son they named Daniel, and finally a second daughter, Lily. Their house, which had seemed so spacious when they built it, became filled with the noise and chaos of children. Rebecca's beadwork production slowed as motherhood consumed more of her time, but she never stopped entirely. It was too much a part of who she was. Matthew continued learning from her, and his skills eventually rivaled her own. He began creating his own designs, pieces that reflected his experiences on the ranch and his love for the land. Together, They developed a reputation for producing some of the finest beadwork in Texas, with collectors specifically seeking out pieces marked with both their signatures. As the children grew, Rebecca taught them about their Apache heritage, telling them the stories her mother had told her, teaching them the language she'd learned as a child. Matthew made sure they understood his family's history too, the struggles and triumphs of building the Double T Ranch. The children grew up fluent in both worlds, comfortable with both identities, suffering less of the alienation Rebecca had known because they had two parents who loved them, and a community that, while not perfect, gradually learned to accept them. James grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch work, often following his father and uncle around the property. Rose was artistic like her mother, taking to beadwork with natural talent. Daniel was the adventurer, always climbing trees and exploring the creek. And Lily, the baby, was the peacemaker, the one who could diffuse her siblings' arguments with a smile. The years passed with the rhythm of ranch life. Spring roundups, summer heat, autumn cattle drives, winter planning. Matthew and Rebecca's love deepened from the passionate intensity of new marriage into something more solid and enduring, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared experience, and unwavering commitment. There were still challenges. Some people in Del Rio never accepted their mixed family. The children occasionally came home with stories of being called names or excluded from games. But they also had friends, both Anglo and Mexican children, and they had the security of knowing they were loved at home. Marcus eventually married a widow from a neighboring ranch, a practical woman named Helen who had 3 children of her own from her first marriage. The combined family gatherings were loud and chaotic, and Marcus seemed genuinely content for the first time since Rebecca had known him. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Matthew gave Rebecca a gift that made her cry. It was a leather-bound journal filled with drawings of beading patterns, some traditional designs he'd learned from her and others he'd created himself. On the first page he'd written, "To my wife, my teacher, my love, thank you for showing me how to see beauty and for making my life infinitely richer. All my love, Matthew." "I wanted you to have a record of everything we've learned together," Matthew explained as Rebecca turned the pages with trembling hands. "And space to add new patterns as we create them. Our children can learn from this someday, and their children after them." Rebecca threw her arms around him, unable to find words adequate to express what the gift meant to her. It was validation of everything she'd carried from her mother, proof that the traditions hadn't died with her, that they would continue through her children and grandchildren. It was a promise that she would never be forgotten, that her heritage would live on. That night, after the children were asleep, they sat by the fire in their workroom as they had so many nights before, beading side by side. Their hands moved with practiced ease, creating beauty from simple materials, weaving together the different strands of their lives into something stronger than either could have made alone. "You ever regret it?" Rebecca asked quietly. "Marrying me, all the difficulty it brought?" Matthew looked up from his work, his eyes warm in the firelight. "Not for one second. You and our children are the best things in my life. Everything else is just noise." "I love you," Rebecca said, the words still carrying the weight of wonder even after a decade together. "I love you too. Today, tomorrow, always." As they bent back to their work, the fire crackling and the children sleeping safely in their beds, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She'd started that fateful evening years ago as a solitary woman beading alone by her fire, convinced she'd always be an outsider, always alone. Now she was surrounded by family, by love, by the beautiful life she and Matthew had built together against all odds. The patterns they created that night were complex, interweaving designs that represented their family. 4 children, 2 parents, different heritages coming together to make something new. Rebecca worked the beads with sure fingers, each stitch a prayer of thanksgiving, each color a memory, each pattern a promise to the future. Their love story wasn't the easiest path either of them could have chosen, but it was the right one. In a wild and often harsh land, in a time when differences were feared rather than celebrated, they'd found each other and built something lasting. Their children would grow up knowing they were deeply loved and that their mixed heritage was a source of strength, not shame. And perhaps, in some small way, their family would help make the world a little kinder for the next generation. As the fire burned low and the Texas night deepened around them, Matthew and Rebecca Turner sat side by side, creating beauty with their hands and with their lives, 2 people who'd found in each other a home more secure than any building, a love more precious than any treasure. The cowboy had sat down to learn her craft, and in the process, they'd both learned something far more valuable: how to truly see each other, how to honor where they each came from, and how to build something new together that honored both their pasts while creating a better future. The beadwork they'd started that first evening had led to this: a full life, a loving family, a legacy that would endure. And in the quiet moments of that anniversary evening, surrounded by the evidence of their love in every corner of their home, they both knew with certainty that they'd made the right choice, that their love was worth every challenge, every obstacle, every moment of doubt. They were home, finally and fully in each other and in the life they'd built. And that was everything.